History is not a record of what was, but a story of what remains. It is an archive of echoes, a library of ghosts. We sift through its dust, piecing together fragments of bone and parchment, hoping to reconstruct a face, a voice, a life. But sometimes, the dust settles to reveal nothing at all. Sometimes, the story is not in the fragments left behind, but in the unnerving totality of their absence. There are places on this earth where the past did not simply fade. It was surgically excised, leaving a scar on the landscape and a void in our understanding. It is in these voids that our deepest fears take root. For what is more terrifying than the prospect of complete and utter erasure? What is more unsettling than a door that was opened and then sealed, with no one left to tell us what lay on the other side? We look for answers in the soil, in the trees, in the whispers of the wind. But the silence that answers us back is a language of its own, a chilling testament to a mystery that refuses to die. This is the story of such a silence born on the swampy, sun-baked shores of the New World, in the fledgling years of an empire's dream. It is the story of the Roanoke colony, a name that has become synonymous with disappearance, a byword for the inexplicable. In the year of our Lord 1587, more than 100 English souls, men, women, and children, sought to carve a new Jerusalem from the primordial wilderness of North America. They brought with them their tools, their Bibles, their hopes, and the heavy woolen clothes of a world away. They built homes, they planted crops, they christened a child. Virginia Dare, the first of their nation to be born into this vast, untamed continent. They were the seed of an empire, the first bold stroke in a grand tapestry of conquest and settlement. And then, in the space of 3 short years, they vanished. Not a body, not a bone, not a single written account was ever found to explain their fate. They were erased from the earth as cleanly as a line of chalk washed away by the rain. The world they left behind was not one of chaos and destruction. It was a scene of quiet, orderly abandonment. When their governor, John White, finally returned from a war-torn England in the late summer of 1590, he found no signs of a struggle, no scorched earth, no bloodstains on the sandy soil. He found only an empty settlement, the houses carefully dismantled, the grounds eerily swept clean. It was as if the colonists had simply packed their belongings and walked away from history itself. The wilderness was already beginning to reclaim what was hers, with vines snaking over the empty plots where gardens once grew, and the tall grasses whispering secrets to the sea breeze. It was a ghost town before the term even existed, a place pregnant with an unspoken tragedy. And amidst this profound and terrifying emptiness, there was one clue. A single cryptic word carved into the weathered wood of a palisade post. A word of 7 letters, etched deep, as if to ensure it would outlast the elements, outlast memory, outlast time itself. That word was CROATOAN. What does it mean, this solitary utterance from the void? Was it a destination, a frantic message pointing the way to a place of refuge? Was it a name, the sigil of an unknown power that had claimed them? Or was it something else entirely? A warning, a curse, the final prayer of a doomed people? For over 400 years, that word has echoed through the corridors of history, a riddle with no answer, a question that breeds only more questions. It is the beginning. They became America's first and most enduring ghost story, a haunting reminder that no matter how brightly we light our fires, the darkness of the unknown is never far away. It reminds us that we are all, in the end, temporary creatures, perched precariously on the edge of a great and silent abyss. Their story is a mirror, reflecting our own anxieties about existence, about our place in a universe that is vast, ancient, and profoundly indifferent to our fate. To understand their disappearance, we must first understand the world that sent them there. A world of ambition and avarice, of faith and folly, a world that believed it could own a continent it had only just discovered. We must sail back across the wine-dark sea to the crowded, grimy, and glorious heart of Elizabethan England, where the dream of Roanoke was born. The England of the late 16th century was a nation caught between a medieval past and an imperial future. It was an island kingdom of fierce pride and deep-seated anxiety, ruled by a formidable aging queen, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who had held her nation together through decades of religious turmoil and foreign threats. London was a chaotic symphony of progress and squalor, a burgeoning metropolis where the spires of new cathedrals jostled for space with the gables of timber-framed houses, and the scent of coal smoke mingled with the stench of the Thames. It was a time of immense intellectual and artistic ferment, the age of Shakespeare, of Marlowe, of Bacon. A new kind of man was emerging, the Renaissance man, driven by an insatiable curiosity and an unshakable belief in human potential. The world was expanding, not just in thought, but in geography. The maps were being redrawn, their blank spaces filled with fantastical beasts and newly discovered coastlines. And for an ambitious, seafaring nation like England, those blank spaces represent Ted, one thing above all else: opportunity. The air was thick with the promise of the new world. Tales brought back by sailors and adventurers spoke of a land of unimaginable riches, of mountains laced with gold and silver, of rivers teeming with pearls. It was a new Eden, a pristine wilderness untouched by the corruptions of the old world, waiting to be claimed for God and Queen. But this dream was shadowed by the looming presence of Spain. The Spanish Empire, fueled by the vast wealth of its American colonies, was the dominant power in Europe. Its galleons, laden with treasure from Mexico and Peru, were the envy and the terror of the seas. For England, locked in a cold war of religion, trade, and piracy, the Americas were not just a source of potential wealth. They were a strategic battleground. To challenge Spain's supremacy, England needed a foothold, a permanent base in the New World from which to launch its own colonial ambitions and to harry the Spanish treasure fleets. Into this arena of grand ambition stepped Sir Walter Raleigh, the quintessential Elizabethan courtier. He was a poet, a soldier, a spy, and a favorite of the Queen, a man of dazzling charm and ruthless ambition. Raleigh was a visionary, and his vision was fixed firmly on the sprawling, unknown coastline of North America. He saw there not just a base for privateering, but the foundation of a new English empire, a place where the nation's surplus population could be put to use, a source of raw materials to fuel its growing industries, and a market for its finished goods. In 1584, Raleigh dispatched his first reconnaissance mission under Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow. They made landfall on the coast of what is now North Carolina, an area of barrier islands, dense forests, and wide, shallow sounds. They found the land lush and fertile. The natives, the Algonquian-speaking Secatan and Croatan peoples, to be, in Barlow's words, most gentle, loving, and faithful. They returned to England with two local men, Manteo and Wanchese, and with glowing reports that seemed to confirm all of Raleigh's hopes. The Queen, delighted, knighted Raleigh and granted him a charter to colonize the region, which he named Virginia in her honor. The dream now had a name and a location. But a dream is a fragile thing, and the American wilderness would prove to be a far more formidable and indifferent reality than the romantic reports had suggested. The first attempt at colonization, in 1585, was a military expedition led by the formidable but inflexible Sir Ralph Lane. 100 men, mostly soldiers, established a small fort on the northern end of Roanoke Island. It was a disaster from the start. The soldiers were ill-equipped for farming and had little interest in it. They expected to find gold and to be fed by the natives. Their relationship with the local tribes, initially peaceful, quickly soured. The English demands for food, combined with their arrogance and their unfamiliar diseases, bred resentment and conflict. After a harsh winter of dwindling supplies and rising tensions, a violent confrontation erupted. Lane, convinced the CROATOAN were plotting an attack, led a preemptive strike, murdering their chief, Wingina. The fragile trust was shattered, replaced by a legacy of bloodshed and suspicion that would haunt the next wave of colonists. When Sir Francis Drake's fleet appeared unexpectedly in 1586, the starving and demoralized settlers eagerly abandoned the colony and returned to England. The first foothold had failed. But Raleigh was not a man to be deterred by a single failure. He understood that a successful colony needed more than just soldiers. It needed families. It needed people with a stake in the land, people who had come not to conquer and plunder, but to build, to plant, to raise their children. He envisioned a true transplantation of English society, a community of craftsmen, farmers, and laborers, bound together by the common goal of creating a permanent home. To lead this new venture, he chose a man who embodied this different spirit, John White. White was not a soldier or a courtier. He was an artist and a gentleman. He had been on the 1585 expedition, not as a combatant, but as a cartographer and illustrator, tasked with documenting this new land and its people. His watercolors are a treasure, the first detailed European depictions of North American life. They show a man with a keen eye, a sensitive hand, and a genuine curiosity about the world around him. He painted the Algonquian people not as savages, but as individuals, with dignity and complexity. He documented their villages, their rituals, their methods of farming and fishing. He was a man who looked at the New World, not just as a place to be exploited, but as a place to be understood. He was also a man with a deeply personal investment in the colony's success. He was appointed its governor, but more importantly, his own daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare, were among the settlers. And Eleanor was pregnant. White was not just leading a colonial enterprise. He was leading his family. Their journey across the Atlantic was an ordeal in itself. For weeks, they were confined to the cramped, foul-smelling holds of the ships, at the mercy of the vast, indifferent ocean. Storms battered them, sickness spread through their ranks, and the monotony of the voyage was broken only by the fear of Spanish warships or the fleeting joy of a favorable wind. The plan had been to sail to the Chesapeake Bay, a more promising location with a deep harbor and friendlier natives, as recommended by Ralph Lane. But the fleet's pilot, a privateer named Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. Whether due to impatience, a desire to get on with his raiding, or some more sinister motive, Fernandez refused to sail north. He deposited the colonists on the shores of Roanoke Island, the very place the previous failed expedition had so poisoned with violence. It was a fateful, perhaps fatal decision. The settlers were left in a place already marked by failure and bloodshed, their backs to the unforgiving sea, facing a continent that had already tasted English steel and found it bitter. Despite this inauspicious beginning, they set to work with a grim determination. They found the fort and cottages from the 1585 settlement in ruins, overgrown and desolate, a grim welcome. They began the backbreaking labor of rebuilding, clearing the land, and planting what crops they could in the waning summer weeks. The air was thick with humidity, the insects were relentless, and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest pressed in on them at night. Yet there must have been moments of hope. The birth of Virginia Dare on August 18, 1587, John White's own granddaughter, must have felt like a profound omen, a sign of God's favor. Here was new life, a new beginning, an English child born of this new soil. She was a living symbol of their purpose, a testament to their faith in the future they were trying to build. But the shadow of the past was long. An early attempt to re-establish contact with the local tribes ended in tragedy when a colonist, George Howe, was found shot full of arrows while crabbing alone. Fear, once sown, is a difficult weed to uproot. The colonists, isolated and vulnerable, realized their survival depended on a steady flow of supplies and reinforcements from England. And as the summer waned and their meager provisions dwindled, a difficult decision was made. Someone had to go back. Someone had to plead their case to Raleigh, to the Queen, to secure the support they so desperately needed. The colonists, in a vote of trust and desperation, chose their governor. They chose John White. He was reluctant to leave his family, his daughter and his newborn granddaughter, but he recognized the necessity. He promised to return by the following spring. It was a promise made in good faith, a promise he had every intention of keeping, but it was a promise that would be broken by war, by politics, by the cruel indifference of fate. As he sailed away in late August 1587, watching the shores of Roanoke recede into the haze, he could not have known that he was seeing his family, his colony, his dream, for the very last time. He was leaving them on the edge of the world and sailing back into a storm that would swallow an empire's attention and seal his people's doom. The world they inhabited after John White's departure was one of profound and terrifying isolation. Imagine the silence that descended upon them as the sails of his ship disappeared over the horizon. That last, tenuous link to the world they knew was severed. They were now truly alone, a tiny island of Englishness in a vast and inscrutable continent. 100 Every sunrise brought with it the gnawing anxiety of the food supply, the constant back-breaking labor of tending to their fledgling crops, and the ever-present need to maintain their defenses against an unknown threat. The heat of the North Carolina summer would have been a suffocating blanket, unfamiliar and oppressive to people accustomed to the damp chill of England. The air, thick with the scent of pine and salt marsh, would have carried the incessant drone of insects they had never seen before, a constant reminder of their alien surroundings. Their community was a fragile ecosystem of hope and fear. In the evenings, families would gather in their rough-hewn cottages, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls. They would have told stories of home, sung the old songs, and prayed to a God who seemed impossibly far away. Mothers would have rocked their children to sleep, humming lullabies that were drowned out by the chorus of unfamiliar creatures in the dark woods beyond their palisade. What did they whisper to each other in those quiet moments? Did they speak of the bumper harvests they hoped for, of the fine houses they would one day build? Or did their conversations turn to the dwindling barrels of flour, the strange sickness that had taken one of the children, the fleeting shadow they thought they saw at the edge of the woods? Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl, could have been a sign of danger. Paranoia is a seed that grows well in the soil of isolation. The unity that had brought them across the ocean would have been tested daily by hunger, sickness, and the grinding psychological weight of their predicament. The relationship with their native neighbors was a knife's edge of uncertainty. The memory of Lane's brutality and the murder of George Howe hung in the air between them, while the Croatan people on the nearby island, the people of Manteo, were cautiously friendly. This drought would have been a death sentence. Their English crops, unsuited to the sandy soil and scorching heat, would have withered and died. The corn, their best hope for sustenance, would have failed. The forests, stressed by the lack of water, would have yielded fewer nuts and berries. The animals they might have hunted would have grown scarce, migrating in search of water. The rivers and sounds would have become brackish and less productive. The very land was turning against them. The hunger they faced would not have been a simple matter of empty stomachs. It would have been a slow, creeping erosion of their humanity. It would have turned neighbor against neighbor, strained the bonds of family, and shattered the foundations of their small society. The strong would prey on the weak. Hope would curdle into despair. The communal prayers for rain would have been met day after day by a brazen, cloudless sky, a silent, celestial mockery of their faith. Imagine the psychological toll of this slow-motion disaster, the constant, gnawing hunger that makes it impossible to think, to work, to hope. The sight of your own child, growing thinner and weaker with each passing day. The arguments, the accusations, the desperate, selfish acts born of an instinct to survive. The social order, the rules and courtesies of English life they had tried so hard to transplant, would have frayed and then snapped under the unbearable strain. Perhaps they split into factions. Perhaps some, led by the more pragmatic or the more desperate, argued for abandoning the settlement and seeking refuge with the native tribes, to swallow their pride and beg for sustenance. Others, clinging to their English identity and their fear of the savage, might have insisted on holding out, on waiting for John White's promised return. Their faith in him and John White's journey back to England in the autumn of 1587 had been one of desperate urgency, but he arrived to find a nation in the grip of a far greater crisis. England was bracing for war. King Philip II of Spain, infuriated by years of English piracy and support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, was assembling a massive fleet, the Invincible Armada, with the singular goal of invading England, deposing the heretic Queen Elizabeth, and crushing the upstart nation once and for all. All of the country's resources, its ships, its sailors, its wealth, were being marshaled for national survival. In this climate of existential fear, the fate of 100-odd settlers on a distant shore seemed a trivial concern. Raleigh's influence and White's desperate pleas were drowned out by the drums of war. Every able-bodied ship was pressed into service for the defense of the realm. There would be no relief expedition in the spring of 1588. White was a man trapped in a waking nightmare. As the seasons turned, he could only imagine the suffering of his people, of his daughter, of the granddaughter he had held for only a few fleeting days. The promise he had made to them must have echoed in his every thought, a constant, torturing refrain. He made a frantic, ill-fated attempt to sail in April 1588 with 2 small pinnaces, but the crew, more interested in the spoils of privateering than the relief of a starving colony, engaged in a disastrous sea battle and were forced to limp back to England, their precious supplies plundered. The Great Armada came and went that summer, defeated as much by English grit as by ferocious storms, the famous Protestant wind. England was saved, and the nation erupted in celebration. But for John White, the victory was hollow. The war with Spain, they found the settlement gone. It was not destroyed, but dismantled. The houses had been taken down, the materials carefully removed. The entire area had been enclosed by a high palisade of stout tree trunks, a defensive measure they had discussed before White's departure. This suggested they had not been taken by surprise. They had had time to build a significant fortification. It was a place prepared for a long wait, or a long siege. But there was no one defending it. The ground within the enclosure was overgrown with weeds and melon vines, as if it had been abandoned for some time. They found several small cannons and iron bars left half buried in the sand, discarded as too heavy to carry. But of the colonists themselves, there was nothing. No sign of a battle. No skeletons, no graves, no scattered remains that would speak of a massacre or a plague. It was an absence so total, so complete, that it felt supernatural. It was as if 115 people had simply become ghosts, their physical forms dissolving into the humid air. White and his men searched frantically, their calls echoing unanswered through the empty clearings. They searched for any clue, any sign that could tell them what had happened. White had instructed the colonists that if they had to leave Roanoke, they should carve their destination into a tree, and to add a Maltese cross if they had been forced to leave in distress. As they searched the palisade, they found it. Carved in block Roman letters, clean and deep into a post at the entrance, was the word CROATOAN. There was no cross. The same word, CRO, was found carved into another nearby tree. CROATOAN, the name of the island to the south, home to Manteo and his people, the tribe that had remained their allies. For John White, this must have been a moment of dizzying, desperate hope. The carving without the cross suggested a plan A to departure, a voluntary relocation to a place of safety. His family, his granddaughter, they were not dead. They were simply somewhere else. They had gone to live with the friendly natives, to wait for him there. The storm, however, was worsening, the winds howling and the sea churning into a violent rage. The sailors, already on edge, were anxious to leave the dangerous waters. They agreed to try to sail for CROATOAN Island the next day. But the storm had other plans. That night, it struck with full fury. A hurricane that snapped their anchor cables and nearly drove the ships onto the shore. The fleet was scattered, battered, and beaten. The captain of the lead ship, his vessel damaged and his nerve broken, refused to risk another attempt. His eyes were set on the easier profits to be found in the Azores, and then on the journey home. John White, a man broken by grief and circumstance, had no power to change his mind. He was forced to sail away, to turn his back on that enigmatic shore, to abandon his last, desperate hope of finding his family. He would never again set foot in the New World. He would die in Ireland years later, his daughter and granddaughter existing for him only as memories, their ultimate fate a wound in his soul that would never heal. He left behind a deserted island and a single 7-letter word that has become the final impenetrable testament of the lost colony. CROATOAN. It was meant to be a signpost, a message of hope. Instead, it became an epitaph. The void left by the Roanoke colonists has since been filled by a swirling torrent of theories, a desperate attempt by the human mind to impose order on the inexplicable. For 4 centuries, historians, archaeologists, and amateurs alike have stared into that void, each projecting their own narratives, their own fears, and their own hopes onto the blank canvas of the colonists' disappearance. These theories range from the grimly plausible to the wildly fantastic, each one a ghost story in its own right, a different path to the same silent, unsettling conclusion. Each attempts to answer the unanswerable. What single fate, or combination of fates, could erase an entire community so completely from the historical record? The simplest and perhaps most brutal explanation is that they simply starved. We know from the tree ring data that they were living through a period of devastating, unprecedented drought. Their English farming techniques would have failed utterly. Their supplies from England were finite. In such a scenario, the colony would have died not with a bang, but with a protracted, agonizing whimper. The social order would have disintegrated under the relentless pressure of hunger. The sick and the weak would have been the first to perish, their bodies perhaps buried in shallow, unmarked graves that have long since been reclaimed by the shifting sands of the island. The survivors, gaunt and skeletal, their minds clouded by malnutrition, might have scattered in small, desperate groups, foraging for anything to eat, their humanity stripped away until only the raw instinct for survival remained. Perhaps the last few, hollow-eyed and delirious, simply wandered off into the woods to die alone, their remains scattered and consumed by the wilderness, leaving no trace for White to find. In this version of the story, the word CROATOAN was a last, desperate plan, a nation they intended to reach but never did, their strength failing them on the journey. The dismantled houses could be explained as a desperate search for firewood, or perhaps the last act of a community salvaging what they could before making a final doomed exodus. It is a bleak and unromantic end, a testament to the brutal indifference of nature. Another, more violent theory points a finger at a human enemy. The colonists were, after all, intruders in a land that was not their own, and their predecessors had left a legacy of violence. Could they have been wiped out in a single swift attack? The Spanish are a prime suspect. The English settlement at Roanoke was a dagger pointed at the heart of their New World empire, a base for pirates and a challenge to their dominance. The Spanish had a well-documented history of brutally eradicating rival French settlements in the region. It is entirely plausible that a Spanish patrol from Florida discovered the colony and, under orders to eliminate any foreign presence, descended upon it. Such an attack would have been swift and merciless, with the express purpose of leaving no survivors and no evidence. The colonists, weakened by hunger, would have stood little chance. The houses would have been razed, the bodies disposed of at sea, and the event struck from official records to avoid a diplomatic incident with England. This theory accounts for the completeness of the disappearance, but it struggles to explain the pristine condition of the site White found, and more importantly, the cryptic carving. Why would the Spanish leave a single mysterious clue pointing toward a native tribe? That clue, of course, points to the other likely perpetrators of an attack, the local Native American tribes. The relationship between the English and the Algonquian peoples was a volatile mix of curiosity, trade, suspicion, and bloodshed, while the CROATOAN were friendly. Other tribes, like the CROATOAN, the powerful chieftain Powhatan, who ruled a confederacy of tribes to the north in the Chesapeake region, later told Captain John Smith of Jamestown that he had personally wiped out a group of white settlers who had moved into his territory. Was this a confession to the destruction of the Roanoke colonists? Had they, in a desperate search for a more fertile land, migrated north from Roanoke Island only to trespass on the lands of a powerful and ruthless ruler? A massive, coordinated attack by a native force could certainly have overwhelmed the small colony. But this theory, too, has its problems. Native warfare in this period typically involved capturing people, particularly women and children, for adoption or enslavement, not total annihilation. Furthermore, an attack does not explain the orderly dismantling of the houses or the lack of any archaeological evidence of a battle. No mass graves, no profusion of arrowheads or musket balls. And again, there is the carving. If a hostile tribe had destroyed the colony, why would they leave a sign pointing to their allies, the CROATOAN? It seems a strange and counterintuitive act. This brings us to what many historians consider the most likely, and in many ways, the most haunting theory of all: assimilation. This is the story suggested by the word CROATOAN itself, read not as a clue to a disaster, but as a simple statement of intent. Faced with starvation, abandoned by their own country, and with their society collapsing, the colonists may have made the only rational choice available to them. They packed up their belongings, carefully dismantled their homes to salvage the precious nails and timbers, and went to live with the only people who could help them survive: the CROATOAN. John White's hope may have been the truth. The colonists were not dead, but had chosen to abandon their English identity in order to live. They have traveled the 50 miles south to CROATOAN Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, and integrated into Manteo's tribe. The English would have brought with them their metal tools, their firearms, and their knowledge, making them valuable assets. The CROATOAN, in turn, would have provided food, shelter, and knowledge of the land. This was not a failure, but an adaptation. Yet, it represents a different kind of death. It is the death of a culture. The Roanoke colonists would have slowly, generation by generation, ceased to be English. They would have married into the tribe, their children growing up speaking the Algonquian language, their Christian faith mingling with and eventually being subsumed by native spiritual beliefs. Their names, their stories, their memories of England would have faded like old ink on parchment. By the time the next wave of English settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607, the Roanoke survivors, if any were still alive, would have been culturally and linguistically unrecognizable. Later explorers and settlers in North Carolina did report encounters with gray-eyed, fair-haired natives who claimed to have ancestors who could speak in a book. The Lumbee people, a tribe in modern-day North Carolina whose origins are mysterious, have a long-standing oral tradition that they are the descendants of the lost colonists, fused with the CROATOAN and other local tribes. Archaeological finds of mixed European and native artifacts in the area lend some credence to this theory. But if this is the answer, it is a bittersweet one. The colonists survived, but their world, the world they had tried to build, vanished completely, absorbed into the very wilderness they had sought to tame. Beyond these more rational explanations, the mystery of Roanoke has always invited darker, more supernatural speculation. The human mind abhors a vacuum, and when facts are scarce, folklore rushes in to fill the void. These are the theories that speak to our deepest, most primal fears. Perhaps the colonists were not destroyed by famine or by men, but by the land itself. Perhaps they fell victim to a curse, a malevolent spirit of the place that they had trespassed upon. The local Algonquian peoples had their own legends, their own spirits and demons of the forest and the water. Could the colonists have disturbed a sacred site, angered a powerful entity, and paid a terrible price? In this telling, the word CROATOAN is not a place name, but the name of a vengeful god, a local spirit, or a monstrous creature that consumed them. It transforms the clue from a signpost into a sigil of doom, the last word uttered by a people staring into the face of an ancient, unimaginable horror. This vein of speculation connects Roanoke to the darker myths of the American continent, like the legend of the Wendigo, a cannibalistic spirit from the folklore of the northern Algonquian peoples. Though geographically distant, the myth speaks to a deep-seated fear of the wilderness turning men into monsters, of starvation leading not just to death, but to a terrifying supernatural corruption. Did the starving colonists, in their final desperate days, turn on one another? Did the unimaginable trauma of their situation unlock some latent darkness within the human soul, leading to a frenzy of madness and self-destruction that left no one alive? Or perhaps the disappearance was not an act of violence at all, but a kind of supernatural abduction. Folktales from around the world are filled with stories of people spirited away by otherworldly beings, of entire villages that vanish into thin air. The Roanoke colonists stumble through a veil between worlds, a tear in the fabric of reality, and find themselves lost in some other time, some other place, from which they could never return. These theories, while impossible to prove, touch upon the profound sense of otherness that the early colonists must have felt. They were in a world that did not operate by their rules, a world with ancient powers and secrets they could not begin to comprehend. In the absence of answers, it is perhaps only natural that our imagination populates the silence with monsters. For centuries, the mystery of the lost colony was a cold case, a story confined to the dusty pages of history books and the shadowy realms of folklore. The physical search for answers ended with John White's tragic storm-tossed departure in 1590. For over 300 years, the land itself kept its secrets, the shifting sands of the Outer Banks, and the encroaching forests covering any tracks the colonists might have left. But in the modern era, new tools and new disciplines have allowed us to reopen the investigation. Archaeology, climatology, genetics, and a renewed respect for Native American oral traditions have shed new, albeit fragmented light on the 400-year-old mystery. The search for Roanoke has moved from the library to the laboratory, from the realm of speculation to the painstaking work of scientific inquiry. Yet, for every tantalizing clue unearthed, a dozen new questions seem to sprout from the soil. The first great challenge for modern investigators was simply to find the colony itself. While tradition placed the settlement at the northern end of Roanoke Island, at a site now preserved as the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, the archaeological evidence there has been surprisingly scant. Excavations beginning in the lack of a substantial archaeological footprint, no deep post holes from permanent structures, no extensive trash pits, no cemetery, has led some to question whether this was the main settlement site at all. The shoreline of Roanoke Island has eroded significantly over the centuries, and it is entirely possible that the heart of the colony now lies beneath the murky waters of Roanoke Sound, its secrets lost to the tides forever. The search for the colonists, therefore, expanded beyond the traditional site. The key, as it always has been, was the word CROATOAN. If the colonists had indeed moved south to live with Manteo's people on what is now Hatteras Island, then evidence of their presence should exist there. And it does. For years, Local residents and archaeologists have been finding a steady stream of late 16th century English artifacts on Hatteras. Things like fragments of pottery, pieces of a rapier, a goldsmith's crucible, and a signet ring bearing the crest of the Kendall family, a name on the colonist roster. These finds, clustered around a site known as Cape Creek, prove that at least some English people were living there, interacting and coexisting with the Native American population. It provides strong circumstantial evidence for the assimilation theory, suggesting a small-scale merger of the two cultures. But it is not definitive proof. Were these the scattered survivors of the main colony, or perhaps a small splinter group? Did the entire community relocate there, or just a few individuals? The evidence is suggestive, but it does not account for all 115 people. A more recent and even more electrifying discovery has shifted the focus of the search once again. A clue, hidden in plain sight for 4 centuries, was uncovered on one of John White's own maps, the Virginia Pars map of Virginia and North Carolina. Using advanced imaging technologies, researchers at the British Museum discovered 2 patches on the map, one of which concealed a symbol for a fort, located not on the coast, but some 50 miles inland, at the confluence of the Roanoke and CROATOan rivers. This location, which archaeologists have dubbed Site X, corresponds to a place that White had been told was the intended site for the permanent colony, a location far from the vulnerable coast and closer to the interior. Could this have been the colonists' true destination? Did they leave Roanoke Island not for CROATOAN, but to follow the original plan and move inland? Excavations at Site X, on a bluff overlooking the Sound, have yielded a fascinating and perplexing array of artifacts. Dozens of sherds of English pottery, including fragments of border ware and North Devon plain, have been found intermingled with Native American pottery of the period. These are not the fancy ceramics of the gentry, but the everyday cookware of English farmers and artisans. They have found aglets, the metal tips of laces, a flintlock mechanism from a pistol, and pieces of lead shot. The sheer quantity and type of these artifacts strongly suggest the presence of a small group of English settlers living there for a significant period. This evidence opens up a radical new possibility, that the colony did not just move to one location, but split up. Perhaps one group, possibly the majority, went to CROATOAN, while a smaller, more adventurous party pushed inland to Site X, seeking the safety and resources of the interior. The carving of CROATOAN at the settlement might have been a message intended for White, indicating the location of the main body of settlers, a prearranged contingency plan. This split colony theory could In recent years, the quest has entered the genetic age, with researchers attempting to find a DNA link between the colonists and living descendants. The Lost Colony DNA Project has been collecting samples from individuals with family names from the colonist roster and from members of the Lumbee tribe, searching for shared genetic markers that could bridge the gap of centuries. The challenge is immense. With such a small founding population and the passage of over 400 years, any genetic signature would be faint and difficult to isolate. So far, the results have been inconclusive, but the search continues, holding out the tantalizing promise that the answer may lie not in the soil, but in our very blood. These modern investigations have transformed our understanding of the Roanoke mystery. They have moved us away from the simplistic narratives of massacre or supernatural intervention and toward a more complex and nuanced picture. The story that is emerging is one of survival, adaptation, and fragmentation. It seems increasingly unlikely that a single fate befell all 115 colonists. It is far more probable that they broke into smaller groups, driven by the drought to seek refuge and sustenance wherever they could find it. Some went to CROATOAN. Some may have gone inland to Site X. Others may have scattered to other native communities, their English identity slowly dissolving into the cultural and genetic landscape of Native America. The lost colony was not lost in a single dramatic event. It was lost in a slow, piecemeal process of dissolution. This explanation is less dramatic than the myths, but it is also more human. It speaks to the desperate, resourceful, and ultimately tragic efforts of a people trying to survive in a world that was turning against them. But even with all our modern science, in the immediate aftermath of John White's failed search, the story was one of failure and loss. A cautionary tale for the investors and adventurers who would follow. The Jamestown colonists, who arrived 2 decades later, were acutely aware of the Roanoke tragedy. They were haunted by it. Early accounts from Jamestown are filled with rumors and fragmented reports about the fate of their predecessors. They heard tales from the natives of white men living among them, and more chillingly, of a massacre carried out by the chieftain Powhatan. The specter of Roanoke served as a constant grim reminder of their own precarious position, a warning of what could happen if they failed to maintain their supplies, their defenses, and their fragile peace with the native tribes. It was the original sin of English colonization, a failure that had to be overcome for the imperial project to succeed. As the colonies grew and the frontier pushed westward, the story of Roanoke began to change. It shed its historical specificity and took on the quality of folklore. It became a tale told around hearths and campfires, a story of a brave band of pioneers swallowed whole by the primordial menacing wilderness. In this telling, the continent itself became an antagonist, a dark and brooding presence that actively resisted colonization. The colonists were no longer just victims of bad luck and poor planning. They were victims of an ancient, malevolent force inherent in the American landscape. This narrative resonated with the experience of settlers who found the New World to be not an empty Eden, but a place of immense hardship, danger, and profound psychological disorientation. The lost colony became a metaphor for the fear of losing one's identity, of going native, or worse, of being utterly consumed and forgotten. The 19th century, with its romantic fascination with the past and the supernatural, fully embraced Roanoke as a Gothic tale. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe were drawn to the story's themes of mystery, isolation, and the dark underbelly of human ambition. The single word, CROATOAN, became a literary device, a symbol of the uncanny and the inexplicable. The story was now firmly entrenched in the American imagination as a piece of folklore, its historical figures transformed into archetypes: the hopeful governor, the innocent child, Virginia Dare, the silent, enigmatic natives. The facts of the case became less important than the emotional and psychological truth the story seemed to tell about the dark heart of the American dream. This transformation was cemented in the 20th century, most famously by Paul Green's outdoor symphonic drama, The Lost Colony, which has been performed near the site on Roanoke Island every summer since 1937. The play turned the historical tragedy into a patriotic spectacle, a drama of courage, sacrifice, and enduring mystery. For millions of visitors, this play has become the definitive version of the story, shaping their understanding of the events and solidifying the colony's status as a legendary, almost mythical event. Popular culture has continued to mine the story for its potent horror. It has inspired countless novels, television shows, and films, from episodes of The X-Files and Supernatural to Stephen King's Storm of the Century thriller. In these modern retellings, the explanation is almost always supernatural: a plague, a demon, a time portal, a vengeful spirit. The colonists have become stock characters in a horror movie, their disappearance a convenient plot device to explore our modern anxieties about the unknown. The assimilation theory, while perhaps the most hopeful for the colonists, is also a story of cultural erasure. If the English survived by joining the native tribes, their descendants were then subjected to the same centuries of violence, disease, and displacement that befell all Native Americans. The mystery of what happened to the English settlers cannot be separated from the well-documented tragedy of what happened to the indigenous peoples they encountered. The silence of Roanoke is echoed by the silenced voices of the native tribes who were decimated in the centuries that followed. Ultimately, The enduring power of the Roanoke myth lies in its resistance to a final answer. It is a story that refuses to be solved. We are a culture that demands resolution, that believes every problem has a solution, every question an answer. Roanoke denies us this comfort. It reminds us that history is not a neat and tidy narrative, but a chaotic and fragmented collection of stories, many of which are incomplete, their endings lost to time. The lost colony holds a mirror up to our desire for certainty and reflects back only a profound and unsettling ambiguity. It is a permanent question mark carved into the foundation of American history, a reminder that we began on this continent not with a clear victory, but with a deep and abiding mystery. The colonists are gone, but their story remains, a ghost that still walks the shores of the Outer Banks, whispering a single cryptic word to the wind. And so, we return to the silence. We return to a sun-drenched clearing on a remote island, to the ghosts of dismantled houses and the faint outline of a defensive wall. We return to the year 1590 and to a grandfather's broken heart. We stand with John White before that weathered palisade post, staring at the 7 letters carved into its grain, CROATOAN. After all the centuries of searching, all the theories, all the scientific analysis, we are no closer to a definitive answer than he was. The word hangs in the air, suspended between a message of hope and a harbinger of doom. It is a destination, a people, a warning, an epitaph. It is everything, and it is nothing. It is the final, inscrutable utterance of a community on the brink of dissolution. The story of Roanoke teaches us a humbling lesson about the nature of history. We think of the past as a solid, knowable thing, a landscape we can map and explore. But it is not. The past is a vast ocean, and what we call history are only the few scattered islands of evidence that break the surface. Between them lies an abyss of the forgotten, the unrecorded, and the deliberately erased. The 115 souls of the lost colony slipped off one of those islands and were swallowed by that abyss. Their tragedy is not just that they died or disappeared, but that they were deprived of their story. They have been denied the fundamental human right to have their lives and their deaths remembered and understood. They have become a vessel for our own stories, our own fears, but their truth remains their own, locked away in an unbreakable silence. What does it feel like to be erased? To have the sum of your existence, your loves, your fears? We are creatures who crave narrative. We need our stories to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Roanoke story denies us this closure. It ends with a question that echoes endlessly, a door that remains forever ajar. Perhaps that is why it continues to captivate us. It is the perfect mystery, a story that can never be spoiled by a final revelation. It forces us to live with uncertainty, to accept that there are some questions that will never be answered, some silences that will never be broken. The colonists of Roanoke are not a problem to be solved. They are a presence to be felt, in the rustle of the sea oats on the dunes, in the humid, heavy air of a Carolina summer, in the dark, quiet woods that press in on the edges of our well-lit world. In the end, the word is all that remains. CROATOAN. It is a poem, a prayer, a riddle. It is a testament to the enduring power of a mystery to shape our imagination. It is the sound of 115 voices, speaking as one, across a chasm of 400 years, telling us that they were here. They lived. They hoped. They feared. And then they were gone. Their story is a permanent part of the American psyche, a whisper of doubt in the grand narrative of progress and conquest. It reminds us that the wilderness we think we have tamed is ancient and deep, and that its secrets are its own. The silence of Roanoke is not an empty silence. It is filled with the weight of all our unanswered questions, a silence that is, in its own way, louder and more lasting than any recorded history.